I wanted to maybe tie some of the comments by Dolar and Žižek. I was struck by your comment about Lukács in affirming a kind of subject. I know the working sort of framework I like that, that one could even see something like the bourgeois epoch vis-a-vis Marx as affirming an individual, a subject that is not really there. And that it reminded me of the last part of the reification essay in which Lukács is critiquing Lassalle because of his conception of the state, in that he's too conservative, in that what he really wants is to force the sort of human dimension of the state. Lassalle wants to force the human dimension of the state, and those are his politics. And Lukács chides Lassalle or critiques Lassalle only insofar as he's saying that the socialism is about the possibility for transformation in order to create something like a subject, not to affirm the sort of subjecthood of the present. And so in that sense, it sort of struck me as parallel to what you were talking about. And I mean, for Lukács anyway, and I don't really mean to make this all about Lukács, it's just sort of raising the issue of socialism and Marxism, but that it reminds me of sort of conception of the waking moment, at least in Lukács's conception, what the proletariat as a historical subject, not as an individual sort of worker, that as a historical subject, it sounds the alarm of capitalism as a moment in crisis, a kind of transition in crisis, the sort of riskiness of the waking moment. Because of course I had the same thought, 1913 is the year before 1914, and to what extent, is this sort of like a moment of awakening, or is it a moment of sort of, back into the crisis of a transition? So all of that to say, then, how does one sort of conceptualize the relationship between the early 20th century moment of a transformative possibility of an opening of some kind, and the sort of issue and problem of modernity, as it has been laid out, and I guess the problem of subjectivity, of a coming into being of a subject, and sort of bourgeois liberalism as it's sort of fading out in the 19th century, already affirming a subject that is not there, and Marxism as posing the question, well, if the subject is being affirmed, and that's the conservative move, then, what is it that socialism is about?
Lukács himself says, in a very naive way even, like, Hegel was simply wrong, that Hegel described what Hegel renders as the logic of the dialectical process is the process of liberation, emancipation. Lukács literally says this, that Hegel just picked up the wrong subject. Instead of spirit, put proletarian revolutionary agent as a collective subject, and so on. No? I think that, that precisely Lukács is not Hegelian there. That the way he reads it, and it's interesting where Marx refers to Hegel in that way, it's mostly Grundrisse. Marx is this fragment in Grundrisse, pre-capitalist formations. This is pure Hegel, but a certain type precisely of Hegel, where Marx proposes the whole scheme of historical development as, again, gradual emerging, but at the same time emptying of subject out of substance. And then we have substanzlose Subjektivität, the working class is a pure subject who then swallows, appropriates the substance. The whole of my work, and theirs also, I presume, is to claim that this is not really at all what happens in Hegel. That this image of Hegel as mega subject, who swallows all, internalizes all content is not. Which is why we have an immediate symptom. That would be but we don't have time, counter question to you. You have in Lukács, did you notice this? I counted 3 figures, there are more. This radical ambiguity of reference to Hegel in the history of Marxism, but already in Marx. In Lukács, it's simply that what he reads as the Hegelian notion of alienation, alienated substance, like the subject externalizes itself and then reappropriates the substance, is the logic of liberation. Now, although they are usually considered as part of the same tradition, what you find in Adorno and in the mainstream of Frankfurt School, already in Herbert Marcuse, is exactly the opposite. It's not that Hegel's logic is a mystified logic of liberation, but that Hegel logic is a mystified logic of the capital. That is to say that to put it very naively, material reality, but not in a vulgar sense, which Hegel is describing is effectively, ultimately, the circulation, self-circulation of capital. And it's incredible how few people this noticed, but some people did, like Moshe Postone made some nice remarks on this, on how radically opposed these two references are with regard to a simple question: what is Hegel describing in a mystified way? People say, no, already liberation, like, you know, and this is the scheme of Marx mostly in Grundrisse, no? Where it's very Hegelian. But then I claim in Capital, Marx is closer to what Adorno and those guys were trying to do. There, you remember, if you read closely Capital, for example, the passage from money to capital is described in purely Hegelian terms as the passage from substance to subject. With the move from money to capital, money is no longer just a substance, but becomes a subject. And what we are trying to do, at least I, in my own way, I will not speak for others, plurality, democracy, blah, blah, is that precisely there is another Hegel. That this image of Hegel who, you know, first you throw it out, then you want to swallow it all, is not at all this. That what Hegel calls Versöhnung, reconciliation, is something much more even pessimistic. It's like accepting a gap, a defeat, and so on.
The two novels, the two scenes of awakening you cite in Kafka are two scenes of not just waking up, but being awakened by authority. You know, moments of interpolation, waking, you know, by being addressed by authority. So it's not, it sounds like at some level you want to posit that as, in a way, what all awakening is at some level, and that I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, I discussed 4 cases of awakening, and the 2 in the novels are actually as you say, the cases where he's woken up by certain authority, and the 2 other ones, which is the Verwandlung, the metamorphosis, and the one in the burrow. It's Gregor Samsa and the badger awake by themselves. I mean, they just wake up at some point. And I think that the purest case of what I'm trying to show or pursue is actually the last one, which is the burrow, which is not quite the last piece that Kafka wrote, which was famously the Josephine the Singer, but the one before last. And what is very amazing in those 2 pieces is if you look at them as a sort of diptych, is that the last object that Kafka is holding on to is the object sound, the object voice. I mean, the 2 faces of this vocal object is the pure sound, which one can't figure out what is the possible source of this. It's just the sound as such. And the singing voice of which are the 2 kind of the flip side of the one and the other. And I think that this logic is developed to the utmost, precisely with the most minimal means in the burrow.
But may I add something, just a sentence? But you know, Henry Cripps years ago wrote a good analysis on interpellation, where we, as you remember, as it were, split the atom, and claim that there is something missing in Althusser's description. It's not simply, hey, you, and then you say, yeah, me. That the first reaction is total anxiety, mess, why me? And then you identify yourself. So here would be these 2 dimensions. You have, this first part would be before the master. It's not yet authority. You call for the master to escape. And this, we get all your bullshit in too muchness, blah, blah. That's the true thing that awakens you, no? I stop. Okay, sorry.
Regarding Lukács that was just mentioned, and the connection to Postone. Postone, I think you're right, the way that you characterized it, describes the sort of Hegelian subject-object that Lukács talks about is actually, in Marx's Capital, being capital itself. Capital is the self-moving substance or subject of history. But when I asked him, I asked Moish a couple years ago, the difference between this and the proletariat would be that, obviously capital is an inhuman, unconscious subject, whereas the proletariat in labor, insofar as it is constituted by capital, labor in the modern sense of a wage laboring class, as a sort of potential subject, would have to be, in order to realize itself, a conscious political actor in history. So I wonder to what extent capital itself, as an unconscious subject of history, as Pistone describes it, might not be the proletarian unconscious.
When you say conscious, unconscious, one will have to clarify so many things. For example, what do we mean by unconscious? My thesis is, just to give you that, what Hegel calls self-consciousness is precisely often pretty close to unconscious. In what sense? Not the other guy, it's the guy from Hermano Bencivenga, from Irvine, the Kantian. But he wrote nonetheless a good short book on Hegel, when he demonstrates that when Hegel speaks about, for example, state as the self-consciousness of society, in what sense that for Hegel there, self-consciousness is meant in a purely formal way as registering this declaratory, what Hegel even uses this example, like you have a big parade, a state ceremony. This is self-consciousness of society in the sense that performatively society, as it were, registers, remarks itself as what it is, declares itself. But Hegel makes it clear this doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that somebody really means it. The king can think how he will screw his mistress in the evening, his minister can think how to grab some millions and so on. It's a purely formal act. And in this sense, Lacan says somewhere very strangely that self-consciousness is an object. In the sense, even a symptom. For example, let's say I want to pretend to want something, but I make a slip of tongue where something else emerges. And I'm not aware of this meaning, but there, in a way of self-consciousness, I register reflexively the meaning of what I want to say. My point being this one, that, and here I think that a guy who we otherwise appreciate very much, Robert Pipin, when he supports Manfred Frank's critique of psychoanalysis, that it's too naive, implying unconscious as some kind of positive given substance which is not yet reflexively mediated. It's totally wrong. The Freudian unconscious is, if anything, the excess of reflection. It's more reflexive that we are consciously. It's not some kind of a natural substance of instincts on which we reflect and so on, no? But going back to Postone, you know what's my basic, I greatly appreciate him. I had a long chapter basically on him. But my problem is, why does he exclude so quickly class? When he is right to emphasize that the dialectic of commodities, the Marxian one, is not simply some positive process, but to put it in old-fashioned term, it functions as a kind of a structural, social, a priori constitutive all. But I don't think that to claim this, you have to abandon class struggle or social antagonism. You know, he, I think, makes the same mistake as someone whom probably he doesn't like at all, Alain Badiou, with whom we also have a great problem. When Badiou says, now in his anti-Marxist move, that class is no longer a society, and then he does something horrible, as if he forgot his own past. He clearly, explicitly reduces classes to social groups, as if society is divided into classes. My God, he should have known this from Althusser, from all others, that class struggle is not a division of society into positive groups, but it's, in a way, to put it paradoxically, an antagonism which is constitutive you know, it's a kind of a transcendental principle of division. It's not you look around at classes, where are classes, and so on and so on. So here I think that maybe Postone goes a little bit too quickly into this, how should I put it, transcendental trap.
I'm intrigued by Alenka's teasing out of the notion of Smut, this idea as quote-unquote something always out of place or a non-coincidence with itself, and Mladen's notion of this edge between sleep and not sleeping and dreaming as constituting a break that doesn't belong to either of opposing worlds, worlds like being and non-being. Did I understand that you call this an ontological opening? It would be an ontological opening that doesn't give us the fixity of being versus non-being, but as something in between. Both and is something that that is a kind of, dare I use a Derridian word here, a kind of undecidable that cannot be reduced, that is irreducible, that we're devoid of being, but also of non-being. A kind of third, a tertium, that supposedly is non-datur. But here it is in Kafka and in your version, if I understood that correctly, in this definition, if you will, of Smut as something that is a non-coincidence with itself, always out of place. So I'm wondering, where does that leave us with, quote unquote, any notion of ontology? If ontos on still refers to being versus non-being.
There is something of, there is some difficulty, and one could say this is the great genius of the stand-up actors to do this, but nevertheless, I think in stand-up, I think there is a certain forced laughter that kind of bridges this embarrassment and that sometimes functions as a canned laughter does in this whatever show. So there is clearly some kind of, before the circulation, this space opens up, there is clearly kind of possible embarrassment. But anyway, this is just, I think it was live show. But in relationship, and I would like to add one thing because—
You're right, we even saw, I think, on the ground, the tables.
Yeah, the public was there, I think, yeah. But in relationship, because I ended rather quickly, and I think perhaps I would like to clarify one point. I wasn't trying to say that, okay, comedy is now this great place where finally we can enjoy, it gives enjoyment its place and so on. My point was first to start to pinpoint how the enjoyment as such is this out-of-place factor that exists precisely always on this, not, I wouldn't say threshold, but rather the conflict already, the crossing, let's say, to subject of subject and the other and so on. So there is this antagonism that also belongs to the structure as such. And now very quickly put, I would say that by finally inventing a place of its own, it also puts it in its place, thereby evacuating the space for thinking, so to say. I think I would even say it like this, and I think there is something in this saying that whereas comedy is for those who like to feel, tragedy is for those who like to feel, comedy is for those who like to think. So it's, but as to this question of non-coincidence with itself in the Smut, my point here, I think, was slightly different because I was trying to make Freud make one more step because it could easily be read in Freud that Smut is this kind of primer enjoyment, immediate in itself, and then only when you move to joke, you have this cut of non-immediacy, of non-coincidence with things. But I try to argue that it is not this that distinguishes them, but that already in the most vulgar Smut, you have this same intrinsic obstacle at work with the work. But then, to some extent, I think, yes, it could be related to us. I mean, but perhaps in a slightly different way to what Mladen was saying.
The crucial problem would be, in the end, the division between being and non-being. And there is an ontological paradox. And I think this is an ontological paradox which came up with modernity, but which actually then one can retrace its history back to ancient times or whatever. And to put it simply, what Lacan called object A. What is this? Is it a being? Is it a non-being? It precisely doesn't fit in this division. It conditions this division and doesn't fit into it. And Lacan himself traces it back. Actually, this was the other possible paper I could give here, but I was afraid it was too abstract. Was precisely the paper on the question of the atom and the then, because Lacan traces it back to Democritus and to the Democritus word then, which is not a being, it's not one, and it's not a not being, it's not a void. So it's this impossible entity which is an improper Greek word formation in Greek, which is between hen and meden. It's an improper formation which is neither negation nor affirmation, or which is the subtraction on the basis of negation, rather. That would be the precise formula for this.
It interests me that you call that an ontological opening.
I think it is an entity, a non-entity, which displaces ontology as such. And I think that Lacan would be actually horrified at the very notion that psychoanalysis should have an ontological foundation.
But there is actually a line that he uses, Lacan, at this very dream, when he says that this is precisely the place when you can say that the status of the unconscious is not ontological but ethical in relation to this precise dream.
Can you know? Yes, but we have to be here very precise first. When you mentioned, I totally agree, that something happens in modernity which renders for the first time palpable this sphere. And we have here many things to say, so that you will not think that we were totally bluffing. For example, my stupid example with which I close, that Hershey bar at its 0 point, it's precisely something which is ontologically nothing. You cannot sell nothing and so on, but it's nothing which has a certain virtual existence and moves all of it. Then, I learned this from you, I think, just to take here. Yes, precisely, I think Kant is maybe crucial here. Why? Kant opened up this domain, you know where, which is why I once proposed a crazy notion of Kant as the original theoretician of vampirism or whatever. You know the beautiful Kantian distinction between negative and infinite Urteil, judgment. Negative negates a predicate, infinite asserts a non-predicate. The point is that the infinite judgment produces this third domain. How? To give you a simple example, I am dead. Negative judgment is I am not dead, which means simply I am alive. No problem, the two spheres. But if you say not I am not dead, but if you assert a non-predicate, if you say, again, not negating the predicate, not I am not dead, but I am undead. Haha, we are in Stephen King territory. It's the undead which are precisely the third domain. And we could develop so many things here. For example, even at the level of space, did you notice this paradox, how at our most elementary phenomenological experience of space, inside and outside are never ontologically coordinated? For example, you have this paradox, it happens to me all the time. You enter a house, and when you're inside, it looks larger than it should be from the outside. Or don't you have, like when you are on a train or in a car, you look through the window, but then if you open the window, as if you are here, you know, and I think that here a third virtual domain of neither being nor non-being emerges, where no wonder that horror movies are obsessed by it. You know, some Stephen King, like, for example, what would this have been? For example, in a house, we have, that's the official story, we have a wall separating outside from inside. The true horrors happen in the cracks of the wall. There you have spirits, ghosts, undead, and all that stuff. And now what I learned from Mladen, I claim that maybe this has something to do with the following thing, that the notion of the double, precisely till Kant, was a comical notion. You know, the notion of the double was in comedies, like, I have a brother who is my double, and then we screw the same lady, and she thinks I was the same guy as, all this stupid stuff. But all of a sudden, encountering a double becomes, with Kant, the most terrifying imaginable experience, I think precisely against the background of this third space. So yes, and this is also why I claim Lacan questions ontology, because a third domain, a crack opens up here, which ruins or undermines, introduces a crack into the standard ontology as all of being and so on. But unfortunately, again, I'm mad at you because you were asking mostly two good questions, you know, and like, in order to answer them, I would have to beat Fidel Castro record and go, but not tonight. No.
Thank you so much, Alenka. Thank you so much, Mladen. Thank you so much, Slavoj.
You are cheating. As a good Hegelian,
yes.
You know what you should do? I wonder if you should thank yourself also.
I thank myself.
Yeah, for organizing this.
For organizing this, and I thank you for coming. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.